The convoy making its way through the forests of Scotland in June wasn't admiring the landscape. It was a piece of rally history in the making. The first ever recce of a British forest event, preparation for the 1988 RSAC Scottish Rally, with the crews compiling pace notes for the rally itself. Useful even for an old hand like Jim McRae, who knows all the classic Scottish stages. And the rivalry had already begun.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, the stages change even from year to year, and the route changes. It's very difficult. You know places. There are places that are familiar, but you don't really know the stages as such. I would say maybe, probably, in some places we'll maybe slow down a bit more because we've got notes. But other than that, I think on the quicker stuff, the quicker parts of the stages will be quicker.
And if we could go quicker through the stages, because it's very difficult to make notes just doing 30 miles an hour.
Are you using the notes supplied and just amending them, or are you making your own notes?
No, we decided we would try the organisers' notes, but there was a bit too much instruction in them, so we're just making our own notes.
What we're meant to be learning? That's not just a jolly. What's a pace note?
This is a pace note, or at least a book of route notes supplied by the organisers and adapted by each crew, giving details of every bend, bump and hazard in each forest stage. Starting at the Glasgow Garden Festival, the rally would go south to Newton Stewart and north to Pitlochry. The first day would be a circular tour of the borders and Dumfries and Galloway, followed by Fife, Perthshire and Argyll for the second leg. Almost immediately, it became obvious that 1988 was going to be different, and not just because of the pace notes. The traditional mud and rain of the Scottish had disappeared in clouds of dust. At the front of the field, David Llewellyn in the works Audi 200 Quattro had clear vision, but behind him, everyone had to cope with the dense, lingering dust. Jim McRae took it in his stride, taking the lead after the very first stage, a full 8 seconds faster than Llewellyn, the previous year's winner. But he was to face problems early on, having to change the gearbox on his Ford Sierra Cosworth after the 4th stage. The Ford mechanics excelled themselves yet again, completing the change in just 12 minutes. The umbrellas, by the way, aren't for the rain or the sun. They're an attempt to keep the dust off. McRae rode ahead, building up a lead of almost a minute by the end of the day. He had set his sights quite clearly to become the first Scot to win the Scottish since Andrew Cowan 25 years before. On his first visit to Scotland, Frenchman Didier Auriol wasn't seeing much of the scenery. He'd already moved up to second place behind McRae. But he still didn't believe he was going fast enough. Just 3 seconds behind McRae on the first stage. He lost valuable seconds later on, though, when he ended up in a ditch before being pushed out again by spectators. His second place was taken by Pentti Ricola in the Mitsubishi, but he still wasn't happy. He felt the suspension setting on the car was too high and that he'd been slowed by the dust clouds. But it didn't stop him giving his usual spectacular drive. Wilson wasn't feeling 100% in his Vauxhall Astra GTE. Nothing to do with the car, it was performing magnificently. He was just slightly under the weather himself. But he still got the most from the car, staying well within the top 10, despite being overpowered by the turbocharged competition. Mark Lovell, for example, in the Cosworth, lying in 8th place. He set his usual storming pace, despite damaging 4th gear on stage 5. A gearbox change and a new differential helped him on his way again, but he also lost time with punctures, and he didn't like the dust clouds much either. A late appearance down the field for Llewellyn, who dropped well out of the reckoning when he lost 11 minutes after a wire came off the petrol pump. He'd also punctured a left-hand wheel 2 miles from the end of the long Castleower stage. Things weren't going well for the 87 winner. Russell Brooks at the wheel of a Cosworth for the first time was certainly getting to grips with the beast. Creeping up the top 10, and on one stage just 3 seconds slower than McRae, and a second faster than Frenchman Oriol's Cosworth. Leading lady Louise Aiken-Walker was happy with her Peugeot, but not so sure about pace notes on gravel, confirmed when she crashed out of the rally on just the 4th stage. While Scottish Championship leader Colin Valentine and his 4-wheel drive Mazda went off on the 5th stage, he recovered to make up lost ground and eventually finished in 24th place. Attracting a lot of attention, though, was 19-year-old Colin McRae, son of Jim, setting a storming pace in his 1300cc Vauxhall Nova. After just 15 stages, he'd made it into the top 10, making it a father and son for the first time in the leadership of an international rally. The car was working hard, but producing amazing results, following a host of turbocharged machines. Rallying attracts all sorts, and they don't just turn out to watch the leaders. As they rested in Castle Douglas, further down the field, those contesting the Scottish Championship were having their own battle away from the international honours. Drivers like Murray Grierson, Kenny Dons, and Stuart Robertson encountered the army crew of Tim Hobley and Dave North in their Land Rover.
Oh, that's an army team.
In the twilight on the return journey north, McRae Sr. was still very much in command, having led the rally from the word go, despite a constant misfire in the Cosworth. The problems seemed to be electrical, but even with just about everything replaced, the symptoms continued. By now, though, he'd built up a lead of more than 2 minutes and was content, although at times having to nurse the car on through the stage. Oriol, though, wasn't quite so happy. He'd lost 3 minutes through a puncture, dropping him down from 2nd to 10th place. Malcolm Wilson had replaced the Frenchman in the 2nd spot. He wasn't directly challenging McRae, but he was only a couple of punctures behind and only too willing to snatch the lead if the opportunity arose. Pentti Ricola in 3rd place still complained about the dust, particularly when he was caught behind Oriol after his puncture. And co-driver Ronan McNamee was having to prop up the dashboard with his knees. The dust problem continued for everyone down the field, including the now displaced David Llewellyn, battling on to try to regain lost ground in what has been a far from lucky Audi 200. Dave Metcalf was working hard with his Vauxhall Astra GTE, which spent much of the time coughing and spluttering in the dust, but he hung on to 10th place. Young Mr. McRae was still there too, using maximum revs to get the most from the nimble Nova, now lying in 8th place, 5.5 minutes behind his father. Harry Hockley had his troubles though in the other Nova, gearbox problems keeping him in 2nd place in the 1300cc class behind McRae Jr. While Chris Birkbeck, another British junior rally team member, looked a good prospect for the future in his Astra GTE. The second day and the crowds were out in force as the rally headed north again, and McRae was happy.
We're quite pleased now. There was a worry last night that we're going to find this misfire. We've got it, and everything, just if we can maintain the lead, we'll be all right.
Was the dust a problem yesterday?
Not for us because we were running first car, but I understand, you know, further back they were having problems in the dust.
But no problems for you?
No problems, no.
What about the heat? It must get pretty warm in there.
It's very warm in here, I can assure you.
But McRae was keeping the heat on for the competition as well. 2 minutes and 12 seconds ahead of second place Malcolm Wilson. He set a blistering pace, but claimed he still had more in reserve should he be challenged. He did have one distinct advantage. By running at the front, he had dust-free vision. Malcolm Wilson was content behind the Scot, turning in remarkable times from the Astra. He complained of gearbox problems, the General Motors mechanics working on it after each stage. Pentti Ricola was cutting every corner to catch the leaders in the Mitsubishi, although he too had damaged his gearbox. He was lying just over a minute behind Wilson after the restart. Russell Brooks modestly put his success down to his tyres, which helped push him briefly to third place after the Bellahouston Park tarmac stage. He dropped down again to fourth, though, once the rally moved back to the loose. By now, Mark Lovell was driving blind, not because of the dust, but because he'd missed out on part of the recce while competing in Holland. But he still managed to keep the Cosworth in fifth place. Phil Collins, too, was giving a colourful account of himself, sixth place in spite of a time-consuming spin. Some low-flying from Gwyndaf Evans, the Group N leader. Colin McRae continued to make rallying history, leading Group A 1300 class to give the rally a father and son domination. And some control problems with the big Rover for Gordon Smith. David Llewellyn fought hard, climbing back to 13th overall after some fastest times during the course of the second day. As Scotland enjoyed its driest June for years, the conditions suited McRae down to the dusty ground. The Cosworth performed perfectly, he had none of the dust problems being encountered down the field, and he had almost a 3-minute lead. After years of success in rallies around Europe, but being thwarted on his home event, he was now perfectly placed at his 15th attempt at the Scottish, and attracting foreign interest too. He had a clear road ahead, the car was on song, and a home-based win looked a distinct possibility. All Malcolm Wilson could do was watch from behind, and to add to his frustration, he'd had some engine and axle problems too. But his driving overcame all of these, and he demonstrated just what a master he is behind the wheel. Pentti Ricola wasn't having things easy either. His Starion had been misfiring, and he had to treat the engine gently around the stages, or at least as gently as the Finn knows how. Russell Brooks found things slipping away from him. He'd replaced a rear caliper, then he cracked the sump of his Cosworth. He was running very late. Bad luck, though, for Didier Auriol. His first visit to Scotland came to an abrupt end in a ditch just 5 stages from the end. But even as a non-finisher, his style and ability had earned everyone's praise, even though he was just a little bit wide at times. And he managed to leave a few reminders from the car of his little break in Scotland. And what about Colin McRae? Only 19 years old, rallying for just 2 years and taking the diminutive Vauxhall Nova to what should have been unattainable heights. Critics of rallying say it's all down to the power of the cars. Colin McRae was proving in the Scottish that it's also about natural skill and ability, and he's short of neither. Dave Metcalfe will remember the 1988 Scottish for all the wrong reasons. A disastrous roll on Ladywell and constant engine problems took their toll, but the GM mechanics still managed to replace the windscreen before the next stage at Craigvinian. The Scottish midges were the least of David Llewellyn's problems. His disastrous start had been impossible to overcome, and although he set fastest times later on, he just couldn't regain the minutes which had been lost. So the scene was set for the final charge to the finish. In many cases, the finish could be just too far away. For others, it could be the final tyre change. But in the Ford camp, at least, the work progressed with a quiet satisfaction.
Jimmy, how's it going then?
It's been going very well. We've had no real problems, just trying to drive 9/10ths and stay in front, really, keep a decent gap.
But you do have a substantial lead at this particular point in the rally, don't you?
Well, I think we've got 2.5 minutes, and provided we have no real dramas, then that'll be okay.
So, how are you feeling? I mean, I know you don't want to be too confident ever, or too over-optimistic.
You're never confident until you're over the finishing ramp, really, because, I mean, anything can happen, so just keep my fingers crossed that everything's going to go all right.
At this particular point, who would you see as your main rival?
I think, well, obviously Malcolm, who's lying second, is going very well, and he's putting up some very quick times.
But obviously the car doesn't compare with yours, does it?
Not really. It's a lesser power, but I'm certainly a much lighter car. But on the very twisty and loose stages, he's as quick as we are. On the faster stuff, we're quicker.
You're now going into the night stages. How do you feel about driving at night?
Don't mind it, really, and again, we're still first in the road, which is a good thing.
Because obviously the dust would be a problem, wouldn't it?
Dust is a problem. They're giving everybody behind us now a 2-minute gap, but I think, you know, in the night, in the still air, it could still be a problem.
Problems of a different kind, though, for George Donaldson.
Bloody strong car.
Is the car all right, though? I mean,
Car's fine. The only problem, the reason we got it is that our rear springs have denatured, which makes the back end very soft. It goes very sideways into corners, and we picked up a rock. In Drummond Hill we went a bit slower and we're actually quicker.
So which stage was that on then?
That's a Rockety, 12 miler, 3 miles in. We thought we had 2 punctures because when the rim finally went, then it felt like 2 punctures, you could go sideways everywhere. I was totally convinced that we'd knackered the car actually, but you know, stopping to change a puncture is a disaster. I mean, you avoid it at all costs.
So the lights fitted and a last wipe of the windscreen and off into the night to see what the darkness might bring. A tactical gathering of the Clan McRae.
Put them off. Put them off.
And tension in the voice of Gwyndaf Evans having to hotwire the coil to get his Cosworth going on the start line at Inverunnen. Daybreak on Loch Lomond and the early morning sun welcomes the growling Cosworth of McRae as it makes its way through the final stages. All he has to do now is finish and the celebrations can begin. Malcolm Wilson pressed on, but unless McRae struck disaster, the 3-minute advantage just could not be overcome. In third place, Russell Brooks, having mastered the brute force of the Cosworth and a smashed sump. And Pentti Auricula 30 seconds behind in the Mitsubishi. But without doubt, the most amazing result from McRae Jr., 9th overall in the 1300cc Nova, to make the '88 Scottish a real family affair, crowning his father's achievement at the head of the field. Beating off the midgies, the crowd waited for the man they all wanted to see. And he gave them all they wanted. McRae Sr. cruised home through the final stage at Cairn Reservoir to the finish back in Glasgow, bringing with him the first home win on the Scottish for a quarter of a century. McRae had seen the Pipers before on his 6 second placings. This time they were playing for him, and the champagne was his too. And while his father celebrated, son was quite pleased too.
Very, very pleased. I never thought we'd be back here today in this position. I would have been happy just to win my class, and maybe I thought it'd be quite difficult even to get into the top 20 with the competition we had.
Not least from your father.
Well, I wasn't really thinking about him, but all the other people with his Finnish and Swedish junior teams, and they just fell by the wayside quite early. So
It's been a good day for the McRaes, hasn't it?
it's been a great day.
I think I'll go and have a quiet bath, and I'll stand in the bar for half an hour.
And what about the Scottish next year?
We'll be back.
Again?
Yes, definitely.
Not thinking of retiring?
No, definitely not. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
So a final shot for the family album and an occasion to remember.